I was reaching for the chair when she said it. That chair isn't yours anymore. Ashley's voice cut clean across the table, sharp enough to stop the clink of silverware midair. No one laughed. No one corrected her. Not even my son. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair I had sat in for over 30 years, and then I simply nodded and stepped away. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even look at Daniel. I just moved to the empty seat at the far end of the table, the one no one ever chose unless there was no other option. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because this story traveled farther than I ever expected. The dining room looked exactly the same as it always had, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore. The oak table Daniel's father had insisted on buying after his first big promotion still stood proudly in the center, polished to a soft shine. The chandelier above us cast a warm yellow glow, the kind that used to make every dinner feel like a small celebration. But that night, the light felt colder somehow, like it was illuminating something I had refused to see for far too long. I folded my napkin slowly into my lap. My hands didn't tremble. That surprised me. At 72, I thought I knew what grief felt like. I had buried my husband just 9 days earlier. I had stood beside a polished wooden casket, greeting people who spoke in hushed tones and offered casseroles I would never eat. I had believed that was the hardest part. I was wrong. Because grief, I was beginning to understand, doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from realization. "Mom, do you want some water?" Daniel asked, but he didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed fixed on his plate, carefully cutting his steak into precise, even pieces like he used to do when he was a boy trying to impress his father. I noticed that. I noticed everything. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded steady. Too steady. Ashley reached for the wine glass in front of her, taking a slow sip before setting it down with deliberate care. She had always been particular about presentation, about control. Even the way she held her fork seemed practiced, as if every movement had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. "We should really talk about arrangements," she said, her tone softer now, but no warmer. "This house is a lot to manage." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked down at the table, at the faint scratches near my plate that Daniel had made when he was 10 years old, dragging his fork across the surface during a tantrum over broccoli. His father had laughed. I had scolded him. We had both cleaned it up together afterward. That mark was still there. Some things stayed. Others didn't. "I've been managing it just fine," I said quietly. Ashley smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. But things change. Things change." Such simple words. So easy to say. I lifted my glass and took a small sip of water. It tasted flat. Or maybe that was just me. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," Ashley and I were thinking, "maybe it's time to consider something smaller. More practical." I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. "Practical," I repeated. The word lingered in the air between us. Practical didn't build this house. Practical didn't raise a child or hold a marriage together for 40 years. Practical didn't sit awake through fevers or wait by the door when someone was late coming home. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it. Because in that moment, I realized something important. They had already made their decision. This conversation wasn't about including me. It was about informing me. Ashley leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting around the room. "Honestly, Margaret, it's just about what makes sense moving forward." My name sounded strange in her mouth. Too formal. Too distant. She had called me Mom once. Years ago. Before everything became calculated. I placed my fork down carefully beside my plate. The sound was soft, almost lost beneath the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. "And what exactly makes sense?" I asked. Ashley's lips curved into something that might have passed for a polite smile if you didn't look too closely. "Well," she said, "this house has a lot of potential." There it was. Not grief. Not concern. Potential. I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger. Not even sadness. Something quieter. Colder. Like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest. I glanced at the chair I had almost sat in just minutes earlier. My chair. The one at the head of the table, slightly worn at the edges, shaped by years of use. By presence. By belonging. "That chair isn't yours anymore." Her words echoed again, softer this time, but no less sharp. I picked up my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. Of course, I said. No one spoke after that. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, like glass waiting to crack. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly sweeping across the window. For a moment, the room flickered with movement. Then everything was still again. I stood up quietly. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, as if he might say something, but the moment passed before it could take shape. I walked out of the dining room and into the hallway, my steps measured, steady. The house felt different now. Not empty. Not yet. Just unfamiliar. As if I were seeing it for the first time. Or perhaps for the last. Upstairs, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. The same way it had been every night for decades. I pushed it open gently. The scent of my husband's cologne still lingered faintly in the air. I paused at the threshold, my hand resting against the doorframe. 9 days ago, this room had been filled with quiet breathing, with the soft rustle of pages turning as he read before bed. Now, it held only silence. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. Downstairs, I could hear the faint murmur of voices resuming, as if nothing had happened. As if something hadn't just shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I walked over to the dresser and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked composed, calm. There were lines on her face I didn't remember noticing before. Not from age, from understanding. I reached up and adjusted the collar of my blouse. A small, ordinary gesture, but it grounded me, because in that moment, I realized something they hadn't. I had been silent, but I had been listening. And more importantly, I had been paying attention. I did not go back downstairs that night. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the faint sounds drifting up from the dining room, the low murmur of voices, the occasional clink of glass, the quiet rhythm of a life continuing without me. At some point, the front door opened and closed. Then silence settled over the house again, heavier than before. I lay down without turning on the light. The ceiling above me looked the same as it always had, smooth and familiar, but it felt farther away somehow, as if the room itself had shifted just out of reach. I did not cry. That part was over. What remained was something steadier. The kind of awareness that comes when all the small pieces finally begin to align. In the morning, I woke before sunrise. That had always been my habit. I moved through the house quietly, my steps instinctive, almost automatic. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's dinner, roasted meat, and something sweet, perhaps the pie Ashley had brought. I opened the refrigerator and looked inside. Everything was neatly arranged, labeled in small, precise handwriting. Not mine. I closed the door. The coffee maker sat where it always had, but even that felt different. I filled it with water, measured the grounds, pressed the button. The soft gurgle as it began to brew was the only sound in the room. I stood there, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot, and thought about how many mornings I had done this before. For him. For Daniel. For a house that once felt full. When the coffee was ready, I poured a cup and carried it to the dining room. The chair at the head of the table was pushed in neatly, as if it had never been disturbed. I did not sit there. Instead, I took the same seat from the night before, the one at the far end. The wood felt colder this time. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth settle into my fingers. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, a pale gray stretching slowly into blue. It was quiet. Too quiet. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Light. Measured. Ashley appeared in the doorway, already dressed, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression composed. She paused when she saw me, just for a second, then stepped inside. "You are up early," she said. I nodded. "I always am." She walked to the counter, reaching for a glass. "We should probably start going through things today," she said, her tone casual, as if she were discussing grocery lists or laundry. "There is a lot to sort out." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Things," I repeated. "Yes," she said, turning slightly toward me. "Paperwork. The house. Accounts. It is better to handle it sooner rather than later. Accounts." I let that word sit in my mind for a moment. "Your father handled most of that," I said. Ashley smiled faintly. "Of course. But now it falls to us. Us. Not you. Not me. Us." I set my cup down carefully on the table. "I see." She studied me for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. Then she looked away. "Daniel will be up soon," she added. We can all sit down together. I nodded again, but I did not commit to anything. She left the room shortly after, her footsteps fading back toward the stairs. I remained where I was, listening once more to the quiet. The house had always been full of small sounds. Doors opening, chairs moving, laughter carrying from one room to another. Now every noise felt deliberate, controlled. I finished my coffee and stood up, carrying the mug back to the kitchen. As I rinsed it in the sink, I noticed a stack of envelopes neatly arranged beside the counter. Bills, statements, official letters. I dried my hands and reached for the top one. My name was printed clearly on the front. Margaret Collins. The address beneath it was this house. My house. I opened it slowly. Inside was a bank statement. I scanned the numbers, the transactions, the balances. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I set it down and picked up the next envelope. Then the next. Each one told a small part of a larger story. A story I was only just beginning to understand. Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice, low and tired. Mom. I turned slightly. He stood in the doorway, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed, as if he had not slept well. For a brief moment, he looked like the boy I used to know. Then it passed. Good morning, I said. He hesitated, then stepped into the room. Ashley said we should talk today, he began. About everything. I met his eyes then, really looked at him. Yes, I said. I believe we should. He nodded, relieved, as if he had expected resistance. Good, he said. That is good. He reached for a mug, filling it with coffee, avoiding my gaze again. I watched him for a moment, then turned back to the stack of papers on the counter. My fingers rested lightly on the top envelope. There was more here than they realized, more than they had bothered to check. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to certainty. Not about what they were planning. That part was becoming clearer by the minute. But about what I would do next. I had spent years taking care of this family, protecting it, supporting it, believing in it. Now, I would do something different. I would observe. I would listen. And when the time came, I would act. Quietly, carefully, and on my terms. By the time the sun had fully risen, the house no longer felt like mine in the way it once had. It felt staged. Every object placed with intention, every surface too clean, too controlled, as if someone had quietly rewritten the rules overnight and forgotten to tell me. Daniel sat across from me at the dining table later that morning, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Ashley stood near the window, her arms crossed loosely, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she had already decided how this conversation would end. I noticed the small details first. The way she positioned herself slightly behind him, but not entirely. Close enough to influence, far enough to appear uninvolved. Daniel cleared his throat. We have been thinking about what is best for everyone, he said. The words sounded rehearsed, like lines practiced in front of a mirror. I did not interrupt. I let him continue. This house is large, he added. It is a lot. For one person. One person. I let that phrase settle. And what exactly are you suggesting? I asked. My voice was calm, measured. Ashley stepped forward then, just enough to enter the conversation without appearing to take over. We think it might be better if you considered something more manageable, she said. A place where you would have support. Support. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering it. And this house? I asked. Daniel hesitated, just for a moment. It was subtle, but I saw it. We could take care of it, he said. Maintain it. Make sure everything stays in order. I looked at him, really looked this time. There was something in his expression I had not seen before. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something closer to discomfort. Like someone standing in a place they knew they did not belong. I turned my attention back to the table. The same scratches. The same wood grain. The same history. Only now, it was being discussed as if it were an asset. A responsibility. Something to be reassigned. I see, I said again. The conversation moved on after that, but the words lingered. They talked about logistics. About timelines. About what would be easier. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I asked a few questions. Enough to appear engaged. Not enough to reveal anything. Because by then, I had already begun to notice the pattern. It was not just what they were saying. It was what they were not saying. No one mentioned my husband's name. Not once. No one spoke about what he had built. About what we had built together. It was as if the past had been quietly erased, replaced by a version of the present that suited them better. After the conversation ended, Ashley gathered a few papers from the counter and placed them neatly into a folder. "We can start organizing everything this afternoon," she said. "There is no need to rush, but it is better to stay ahead." Stay ahead? Of what? I wondered. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse. "Of course," I said. Daniel gave me a small, relieved smile. "Thank you, Mom," he said. I nodded once, then turned and walked out of the room. The hallway felt longer than it used to. Or perhaps I was simply seeing it differently now. I moved toward the study, a room that had once belonged almost entirely to my husband. The door was closed. That, too, was new. I paused for a moment, then reached for the handle and opened it. The air inside was still, undisturbed. The desk sat exactly as he had left it, papers stacked in careful piles, a pen resting precisely where he had placed it. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then I walked to the desk and ran my fingers lightly across the surface. There was a drawer on the right side, one he had always kept locked. I knew where the key was. I had always known. I opened the small box on the shelf behind the desk and retrieved it, holding it between my fingers for a second before sliding it into the lock. It turned easily. Inside, there were documents, folders, records, things he had never felt the need to explain, because he had trusted that I would understand when the time came. I opened the first folder, then the next. Each page added another piece to the picture. Ownership, accounts, signatures, dates, details that had been quietly arranged long before any of this began. I sat down slowly in his chair, the leather still creaking softly beneath my weight. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to take a deeper breath. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood. Downstairs, I could hear Ashley moving through the kitchen, the soft rhythm of cabinets opening and closing. Daniel's voice followed, low and steady, discussing something I could not quite make out. Their voices blended together, confident, certain. They believed they were in control. I closed the folder gently and placed it back in the drawer. Then I locked it again, returning the key to its place. As I stood up, I glanced once more around the room. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Because now, I knew something they did not. And that changed everything. The rest of that day unfolded slowly, almost quietly, but beneath the surface something had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. I moved through the house the same way I always had, but now I paid attention to things I had once overlooked. The small pauses in conversation when I entered a room. The way Ashley would lower her voice when speaking to Daniel, as if certain words were not meant for me. The careful way documents were stacked, moved, then restacked again. It was not chaos. It was planning. In the afternoon, Ashley called me into the living room. A folder rested neatly on the coffee table, aligned perfectly with the edge as if placement alone could make it official. Daniel sat on the couch, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. He looked up when I entered, offering a tight smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We just want to make things easier for you," he said. I nodded and took a seat across from them. Not the armchair I used to favor, but the one beside it. A small adjustment. A quiet acknowledgement of what had already been taken. Ashley opened the folder and slid a few papers toward me. "These are just preliminary ideas," she said. "Nothing is final. We want your input." I glanced down at the pages. The words were familiar, but the arrangement was not. Property valuation. Market estimates. Suggested timelines. It read less like a conversation and more like a plan already in motion. "You have been busy," I said. My voice remained steady. Ashley smiled again, that same measured expression. "We just want to stay organized." Organized. Another word that sounded harmless until you looked at what it concealed. I turned a page slowly, letting my fingers trace the edge of the paper. There it was again. The language. Not about memories. Not about history. Only about numbers. Value. Potential. I looked up at Daniel. "When did you start thinking about this?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to notice. "We talked about it after the funeral," he said. "After the funeral? 9 days. That was all it took to turn a lifetime into a transaction." I nodded once. "I see." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. "Margaret, this is not about taking anything from you. It is about making sure you are comfortable." Comfortable. I folded my hands in my lap. "I have been comfortable here for a very long time," I said. There was a brief silence. Not heavy, not tense, just enough to reveal what was not being said. Daniel shifted in his seat. Things are different now, he said quietly. I met his gaze again. Yes, I said. They are. I closed the folder and placed it gently back on the table. I will need some time to look through all of this, I added. Ashley nodded quickly. Of course. Take all the time you need. But there was something in her voice that suggested time was not something she intended to give freely. I stood up, smoothing my skirt once more. I appreciate you both putting this together, I said. The words came easily. Too easily. Because appreciation did not require agreement. It only required patience. I left the room before either of them could respond. Upstairs, the house felt quieter again. I returned to the study, closing the door behind me as I had earlier that day. The room held the same stillness, the same sense of order that had always defined my husband. I walked to the desk and rested my hand against its surface, feeling the solid wood beneath my fingertips. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember, not just the man, but the way he had moved through life. Careful, deliberate, always a step ahead, even when no one else realized it. You should always know where things stand, he used to say, even when no one else does. At the time, I had thought he was speaking about business, about contracts, about investments. Now, I understood he had meant something more. I opened the drawer again, retrieving one of the folders I had examined earlier. This time, I read more carefully, not just the titles, the details, ownership structures, account designations, signatures that carried weight far beyond what Ashley and Daniel seemed to understand. My name appeared again and again, not as an afterthought, but as the foundation. I sat down and placed the folder in front of me, aligning it carefully with the edge of the desk, just as Ashley had done downstairs. It was a small gesture, but it meant something different now, because this was not about control. It was about clarity. Outside the window, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows. Across the yard, I could hear faint movement below, the distant sound of drawers opening, footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Life continuing, plans unfolding. I closed the folder and leaned back slightly in the chair. They believed they were preparing for the future. They believed they were managing something that needed to be taken over. But they were working with incomplete information. And incomplete information can be dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it creates confidence where caution should exist. I stood up slowly and returned the folder to its place, locking the drawer once more. As I placed the key back where it belonged, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again. Not rushed, not emotional, just clear. Downstairs, Ashley's voice rose slightly, calling Daniel's name, followed by a brief exchange I could not fully hear. It sounded ordinary. It sounded controlled. It sounded like people who believed they understood the situation they were in. I turned off the light in the study and stepped into the hallway. The house stretched out before me, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Every room held a memory, every corner a piece of something they had not considered. I moved toward the stairs, my steps steady, measured. There was no urgency in what I was doing. No need to rush. Because for the first time since that dinner, I was not reacting anymore. I was waiting. And waiting, I had learned, was not a weakness. It was a strategy. The next morning began with a kind of quiet that no longer felt peaceful. It felt deliberate. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the kitchen. The counter had been cleared of the envelopes I had seen the day before. The stack of papers was gone. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Moved. I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, and then I continued as if nothing had changed. Because that was the rhythm now. They adjusted. I observed. The coffee maker was already running, the scent filling the room before I even reached the counter. Ashley stood by the sink, her back to me, rinsing a glass that was already clean. "Good morning," she said without turning. "Good morning," I replied. I walked to the cabinet and took down a cup, the same one I had used for years. It was still there. Some things, apparently, had not yet been reassigned. "Daniel had to leave early," she added. "He has a meeting." I nodded, though she could not see it. Of course. I poured my coffee and turned slightly, leaning against the counter. "You moved the papers," I said, my tone neutral. She dried her hands slowly before facing me. "I put them somewhere safer," she replied. "There is no need to leave important documents out in the open." "Safer." I held her gaze for a moment, then looked down at my cup. "That makes sense," I said. She studied me briefly, as if waiting for something more. When nothing came, she smiled faintly and turned back to the sink. I took my coffee to the dining room again, choosing the same seat at the far end without hesitation. Consistency mattered. It created the illusion of acceptance. Outside, the sky was clear, the kind of bright blue that usually brought a sense of calm. Today, it only made the stillness inside the house more noticeable. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet stretch. Then I stood up and walked toward the hallway. As I passed the living room, I noticed the folder from the day before was no longer on the coffee table. The surface was empty, perfectly arranged, as if the conversation itself had been cleared away. I continued down the hall, my steps unhurried, and made my way toward the kitchen again. Ashley had moved to the counter, her phone in hand, her voice low as she spoke. She did not see me at first. I stopped just short of the doorway, not close enough to be obvious, but near enough to hear. "Yes, we are looking at options," she was saying. A pause. "No, she has not signed anything yet." Another pause. Her tone shifted slightly, more controlled. "I understand, but we need to be careful with timing." Timing. I remained still, my hand resting lightly against the wall. "Yes," she continued. "Once everything is transferred, it will be much simpler." Transferred. The words settled in my mind, precise and deliberate. There was a faint sound on the other end of the line, too distant to make out, but Ashley responded quickly. "No, she does not know the full details," she said. "Not yet." I stepped back quietly, retreating down the hallway before she could turn and see me. My movements were slow, measured, the same as always. Nothing hurried, nothing reactive. Upstairs, the air felt cooler. I walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing faintly in the stillness. For a moment, I stood there, letting the words settle. Not yet. That was what she had said. Not yet. Which meant there was something they believed I did not know. Something they were waiting to reveal. Or perhaps something they hoped I would never discover at all. I crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed, folding my hands in my lap. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt layered. Conversations beneath conversations. Plans beneath plans. I looked toward the doorway, half expecting to hear footsteps, but none came. They were confident. That was the first mistake. Confidence built on assumptions always left something exposed. I stood up and walked to the dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept a few personal items. Letters, old photographs, things that held meaning beyond their physical form. I picked up one of the photographs, a simple one taken years ago in the backyard. Daniel stood beside his father, both of them smiling in a way that felt genuine, unguarded. I studied it for a moment, then placed it back exactly where it had been. Downstairs, I heard movement again. A cabinet closing, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary sounds. But now, each one carried a different weight. I moved toward the door and opened it slowly, stepping back into the hallway. The light from the window at the far end stretched across the floor, casting long shadows that shifted as I walked. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. I made my way back to the study, closing the door behind me once more. The desk waited exactly as I had left it. The drawer remained locked. I did not open it this time. I did not need to. I already knew what was inside. Instead, I stood there, my hand resting lightly against the wood, and allowed myself a small, quiet breath. They believed they were moving forward. They believed they were managing a process I had yet to understand. But what they did not realize was that the process had begun long before they ever considered it. And now, I was no longer simply observing. I was preparing, not loudly, not visibly, but with a clarity they could not yet see. And when the time came, there would be no confusion, no uncertainty, only truth. By the third day, the pattern had become clearer than any words they had spoken. It was not just the conversations I overheard or the papers that appeared and disappeared. It was the rhythm of the house itself. The way decisions were being made without pause, without hesitation, as if the outcome had already been agreed upon somewhere beyond my reach. I adjusted to that rhythm, not by resisting it, but by moving within it. Quietly, carefully. That morning, I chose to sit in the living room instead of the dining area. A small change, but enough to alter the flow of the day. Ashley noticed. She always noticed. "You are not having breakfast at the table?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes observant. "Not today," I replied. I held a book in my hands, though I had not turned a page in several minutes. It was not about reading. It was about watching without appearing to watch. She nodded and continued into the kitchen, but I could feel her awareness linger. Control often reveals itself in small adjustments. A glance, a pause, a question that seems casual but is anything but. A few minutes later, her phone rang again. This time, she did not leave the room. She answered it near the window, her voice lowered just enough to suggest privacy without drawing attention. I did not look up. Yes, she said softly. We are close. A pause. No, she has not questioned anything. Another pause, longer this time. The documents are ready. We just need the right moment. The right moment. I turned a page slowly, letting the sound of paper fill the silence between her words. Yes, she continued. Daniel will handle that part. It will look natural. Natural. That word carried a weight she did not seem to recognize. Nothing about this was natural. Not the timing. Not the coordination. Not the quiet certainty behind her voice. When she ended the call, she remained by the window for a moment, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her expression unchanged. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than expected. I heard the front door open, the familiar sound of his keys placed carefully on the entry table. His footsteps were slower than usual, measured, as if he were considering something with each step. Mom, he called. I set the book aside and looked up. I am here, I said. He appeared in the doorway, his jacket still on, his expression more serious than it had been in days. Do you have a moment? He asked. I nodded. Of course. He sat across from me, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together again. It was a habit he had developed recently, a way of grounding himself, perhaps, or a sign of discomfort he did not fully understand. Ashley and I were thinking, he began, then paused. The words did not come as easily this time. We want to make sure everything is secure, he continued. Secure. Another word chosen carefully. There are a few documents we would like you to review, he added. I tilted my head slightly. Review, I repeated. He nodded quickly, just to make sure everything is in order. Nothing complicated. Nothing complicated. I studied his face for a moment, the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes shifted just slightly to the side before returning to mine. He was not entirely comfortable with this. That much was clear, but he was committed to it. That was the difference. I would be happy to look at them, I said. His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. Thank you, he said. We can go over them tonight. Tonight. The timing was precise. Coordinated. I nodded once. That sounds fine. He stood up then, as if relieved to have completed his part of the conversation. I will let Ashley know, he said, and then he left the room. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning. The calls, the documents, the timing, the language. It was all part of the same structure, a structure they believed I could not see. As evening approached, the house settled into a familiar quiet. Dinner was prepared, served, and eaten with the same controlled calm that had defined the past few days. Conversation remained light, almost deliberately so. Weather, errands, small details that filled space without meaning. And then, as if following an unspoken signal, Ashley stood and retrieved a folder from the counter. Shall we? She said, her tone polite, composed. Daniel nodded and looked at me. Whenever you are ready, he added. I placed my napkin beside my plate and stood up slowly. I am ready, I said. We moved to the living room together, the same space where the previous conversation had taken place. The folder was placed on the coffee table once more, aligned perfectly, just as before. Ashley opened it and turned it toward me. These are standard documents, she said. Just formalities. Formalities. I looked down at the pages, my eyes scanning the text with a calm that surprised even me. Because there it was. Not hidden, not disguised, just presented in a way they believed would go unquestioned. A transfer, a shift in control, a redefinition of ownership, all framed as something simple, something necessary, something natural. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes first, then Ashley's. Neither of them spoke. They were waiting, expecting, certain. I placed my hand gently on the top page, feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingertips. And in that moment, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed this was the moment everything would change. They believed this was the step that would secure their position. What they did not understand was that everything had already changed. Not when the documents were prepared, not when the conversations began, but the moment I started paying attention. And now, I was not just aware. I was ready. I did not sign anything that night. I let my fingers rest on the paper for a moment longer than necessary. Then I slowly withdrew my hand and looked up at them with a calm expression that revealed nothing. I would like a little more time, I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle. Ashley's smile held, but it tightened just slightly at the corners. Daniel nodded quickly, too quickly. Of course, he said. There is no rush. But there was a rush. I could feel it in the way Ashley closed the folder just a bit faster than before, in the way her eyes flickered toward Daniel for a fraction of a second. Timing mattered to them. And now, I had disrupted it. The next morning, I woke even earlier than usual. The house was still, wrapped in that fragile quiet that only exists before the day begins. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple blouse and a light cardigan, the same kind of outfit I had worn for years. Nothing about me suggested urgency. That was important. I moved through the hallway and into the study, closing the door softly behind me. This time, I did not hesitate. I unlocked the drawer, retrieved the documents, and placed them carefully on the desk. The first call I made was not long. The number had been written in my address book for years, though I had not needed to use it recently. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," I said when he answered. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by recognition. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady, familiar. "I was wondering when you might call." I allowed a small breath to leave me, not relief, but acknowledgement. "I believe it is time," I replied. We spoke quietly, efficiently. There was no need for long explanations. He understood the structure. He understood the documents. More importantly, he understood my husband. "Everything is still exactly as he arranged it," he confirmed. "Nothing has changed." I glanced down at the papers in front of me, my name appearing again and again in places Ashley and Daniel had clearly overlooked. "I thought so," I said. "They are preparing something," I added. "A transfer." Mr. Harris was silent for a moment. Then, calmly, "They cannot transfer what they do not control." I closed my eyes briefly, letting that sentence settle. Not because I needed reassurance, but because it confirmed what I already knew. "I would like you to come by," I said. "This afternoon, if possible." "I will be there," he replied without hesitation. After I ended the call, I sat for a moment longer, my hands resting on the desk. The room felt different now. Not just a place of memory, but a place of clarity. I returned the documents to the drawer, locked it, and placed the key back exactly where it belonged. Then I stood and left the study as if nothing had happened. Downstairs, Ashley was already in the kitchen, her movements precise, controlled. She glanced at me briefly. "You are up early again," she said. "I have always been," I replied. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took my usual seat at the far end of the table. Consistency. It kept them comfortable. It kept them certain. The morning passed without incident. Small conversations. Quiet movements. The same careful balance of observation and performance. Around noon, Daniel returned home, his expression focused, his steps slightly quicker than usual. "We should revisit the documents today," he said, almost immediately. I looked at him, then at Ashley, who stood just behind him, her posture composed, her eyes watchful. "This afternoon," I said calmly. "That would be fine." Ashley smiled, a little more relaxed this time. "Perfect," she said. "Perfect." The word lingered in the air. A little after 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound cut cleanly through the quiet of the house, precise and undeniable. Ashley frowned slightly, glancing toward Daniel. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. I stood up slowly, smoothing my cardigan as I walked toward the door. My steps were steady, unhurried. When I opened it, Mr. Harris stood on the other side, his posture straight, his expression calm, carrying a slim leather briefcase in his hand. "Good afternoon, Margaret," he said. "Good afternoon," I replied. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Behind me, I could feel the shift immediately. The air changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Ashley's voice came from the living room, carefully neutral. "Who is that?" I closed the door gently before turning back toward them. "Someone who will help us review the documents," I said. Mr. Harris stepped forward, offering a polite nod. "I am here to ensure everything is handled properly," he added. Daniel stood up slowly, confusion flickering across his face. Ashley's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened, calculating, adjusting. I moved past them and took a seat, not at the far end this time, but closer to the center. Not the head of the table. Not yet, but closer. Shall we begin? I said quietly. And for the first time since this began, I saw something I had not seen before. Uncertainty. No one moved at first. The room held a stillness that felt different from before, not the quiet of control, but the quiet that comes when something unexpected enters a carefully arranged plan. Mr. Harris placed his briefcase gently on the table and opened it with calm precision, as if he had done this 100 times before, which I suspected he had. Ashley remained standing for a moment longer than necessary before slowly taking her seat, her posture straight, her expression composed but no longer effortless. Daniel sat down more heavily, his eyes shifting between me and the man across the table. "I do not understand," he said finally. His voice was not confrontational. It was uncertain. Mr. Harris offered a small, polite nod. "That is why I am here," he replied. He removed a set of documents from his briefcase and placed them on the table, aligning them carefully, mirroring the same controlled movements Ashley had relied on for days. Only this time, the control belonged to someone else. "Margaret asked me to review the current situation," he continued, "and to clarify any misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. The words settled differently now. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her tone measured. "There is no misunderstanding," she said. "We are simply trying to organize things in a way that makes sense for everyone." Mr. Harris met her gaze calmly. "I am sure that is your intention," he said. "However, intention and authority are not always the same." The room went quiet again. I did not speak. I did not need to. Mr. Harris opened the first document and turned it toward Daniel. "This property," he said, his voice even, "is held solely in Margaret's name." Daniel frowned, his eyes scanning the page. "That cannot be right," he said. "My father," his voice trailed off. Mr. Harris did not interrupt. He simply turned to the next page. "Your father arranged his estate very carefully," he said. "He ensured that all primary assets, including this house, were transferred directly and exclusively to Margaret." I watched Daniel's expression shift, the certainty fading, replaced by something slower, heavier. Understanding. Ashley remained still, but her eyes moved quickly, calculating, reassessing. "There must be shared authority," she said. "Marital assets do not just—" She stopped herself, adjusting her tone. "There are procedures." Mr. Harris nodded slightly. "There are," he agreed. And they were followed. He placed another document on the table, this one bearing signatures that carried weight far beyond the room we sat in. "There is no joint ownership here," he added. "No automatic transfer of control. Any changes would require Margaret's explicit consent." Explicit consent. The phrase lingered in the air, clear and unambiguous. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing something he had overlooked before. "Mom," he began, but the word did not lead anywhere. I held his gaze calmly. "You should continue," I said quietly, directing my attention back to Mr. Harris. He inclined his head slightly and continued. "In addition," he said, "the accounts associated with this property, including maintenance and tax allocations, are also under Margaret's sole authority." He paused, allowing the information to settle. "Which means," Ashley said slowly, her voice controlled but tighter now, "that nothing can be done without her approval." Mr. Harris nodded once. "That is correct." Silence followed. Not the fragile kind from before, but something heavier, more final. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. Because this was not a revelation to me. It was a confirmation. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders lowering as if something had just been removed from them, or perhaps placed upon them. "Why did you not tell us?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I considered the question for a moment. "You did not ask," I replied. The simplicity of the answer seemed to land harder than anything else that had been said. Ashley's gaze shifted to me, sharper now, no longer softened by politeness. "This changes things," she said. I met her eyes steadily. "Yes," I said. "It does." Mr. Harris closed the folder in front of him with the same measured precision. "My role here is not to interfere," he said, "only to ensure that all parties understand the legal reality of the situation." Legal reality. Not opinion. Not interpretation. Reality. Ashley leaned back slightly, her posture adjusting, recalibrating. The control she had held so carefully was no longer absolute. It had limits now, defined ones. Daniel remained quiet, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the table. I stood up slowly, smoothing my cardigan as I did. The movement drew their attention without effort. I believe we all understand the situation now, I said. My voice was calm, steady, leaving no space for confusion. No one disagreed. No one argued. Because there was nothing left to argue. The facts had already been laid out, clear and unchangeable. Mr. Harris gathered his documents and placed them back into his briefcase. If there are any further questions, he said, I am available. Ashley did not respond. Daniel nodded faintly. I walked with Mr. Harris to the door, my steps measured, my posture unchanged. When I opened it, the late afternoon light spilled across the floor, warm and steady. Thank you, I said quietly. He gave a small nod. He planned well, he replied. I understood exactly who he meant. After he left, I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment. The house felt different again. Not unfamiliar. Not controlled. Simply clear. Behind me, I could sense the shift in the room, the recalibration of expectations, the quiet realization that something they had assumed was already theirs had never been within their reach at all. I turned back toward the living room and walked in slowly. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because for the first time since that dinner, the balance had been restored. And this time, it was not based on assumption. It was based on truth. The silence after the door closed did not feel fragile anymore. It felt settled, like something had finally found its proper place. I walked back into the living room without hesitation, my steps steady, my posture unchanged. Daniel remained seated, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes fixed downward, as if he were still trying to piece together something that no longer needed explanation. Ashley stood near the window, her arms crossed again, but this time the gesture carried a different meaning. Not control, not certainty, something closer to restraint. I did not return to the seat I had taken earlier. Instead, I moved past them and into the dining room. The table stood exactly as it always had, polished, steady, familiar. The chair at the head of the table remained pushed in neatly, untouched since that night. I paused beside it, my hand resting lightly on its back, feeling the worn edges beneath my fingertips. For a moment, no one followed. Then I heard their footsteps behind me, slower now, more deliberate. I pulled the chair out and sat down without a word. The movement was simple, quiet, but it carried something neither of them could ignore. Daniel stopped just inside the doorway. Ashley remained a step behind him. Neither spoke. I looked down at the table, at the faint marks that had been there for decades, at the small imperfections that told the story of a life lived fully within these walls. Then I lifted my gaze. We should be clear about something, I said. My voice was calm, even, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Daniel shifted slightly, as if preparing to respond, but no words came. Ashley remained still, her expression composed, but her attention fixed entirely on me now. This house, I continued, is not a question. It is not a discussion. It is not something to be managed on my behalf. I let the words settle, not rushed, not emphasized, simply stated. It is mine. The statement did not rise in volume. It did not need to. It carried its own weight. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering further, the last of his resistance fading into something quieter. I understand, he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it once had. Ashley's gaze shifted slightly, her posture, adjusting once more, searching for a position that no longer existed. We were only trying to help, she said, her tone measured, careful. I met her eyes steadily. Help requires honesty, I replied. And clarity. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. Not defeated, not entirely, but changed. I folded my hands lightly on the table, the same way I had done countless times before, but this time the gesture belonged to me again. There will be no transfers, I said. No adjustments. No arrangements made without my direction. Daniel nodded slowly. Of course, he said. We did not realize. His voice trailed off, the rest of the sentence unnecessary. I did not respond to that. There was nothing to correct, nothing to revisit. The understanding had already been established. I stood up again, pushing the chair back into place with quiet precision. The sound was soft, Controlled, final. You are both welcome to stay here, I added. But that is a choice I am offering, not something you are entitled to. The distinction was clear. Ashley's expression tightened briefly, then smoothed again into something neutral. We appreciate that, she said. I nodded once, acknowledging the words without attaching anything further to them. Because appreciation, like intention, only mattered when it aligned with action. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving them in the dining room without waiting for a response. The house felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the uncertainty had been removed. Each room held its place again. Each space carried its meaning without question. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the counter, looking out toward the backyard. The light had begun to soften, stretching long across the grass, touching the edges of the garden I had tended for years. Behind me, I heard quiet movement. A chair shifting, soft footsteps, the low murmur of voices that no longer carried the same confidence as before. I did not turn around. I did not need to. For the first time since all of this began, there was nothing left to observe, nothing left to anticipate, only the steady presence of something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. I set the glass down gently and rested my hands against the counter. The house was still, not empty, not tense, simply still. And in that stillness, I understood something with complete clarity. Control had never truly been taken from me. It had only been assumed. And now, that assumption had been removed. I turned off the light in the kitchen and walked back toward the hallway, my steps unhurried, my posture unchanged. As I passed the dining room, I glanced briefly at the table, at the chair at its head, now returned to its place without question. No one stood near it. No one reached for it. It remained exactly where it belonged. And this time, there was no one left to say otherwise.